Welcome to the Tennessee Master Row Crop Series. I'm Andrew Muhammad. I'm a professor with the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of Tennessee Institute of Agriculture. What I'd like to talk about today is the outlook for U.S. agricultural trade with a particular focus on the primary row crops, as well as a focus on the importance and impacts of China in the US China Phase 1 trade deal. So, overall, what I'd like to just highlight in this presentation is just the importance of US exports, particularly with these four major commodities: cotton, corn, soybeans, and wheat. And I'd like to highlight export growth over time, the importance of destination markets to overall export disappearance. And I do want to say a bit about the state of Tennessee and where we fit in terms of these four commodities. Then next, I'll pivot to the overall agricultural trade outlook for 2021 from USDA and its implications and impacts on these four commodities. What can we expect to see moving forward in 2021? And then lastly, I want to just give an update and overview of the Phase 1 trade agreement with China. And what's important there is the importance of China as a customer, a buyer of US agriculture, particularly a buyer of cotton, corn, soybeans, and wheat, and how that trade deal has affected these sectors for US producers. So when we think about those four commodities, they all fall within the top 10 exports for the United States in terms of US agricultural exports. And so, for instance, soybeans tops the list at around $26 billion. Corn is second at over 9 billion in exports. And then you also see wheat and cotton, both at around $6 billion. Now, in spite of soybeans sort of clearly being the leading agricultural export, um, as you could see going back over the last 20 years, exports in these four categories tended to be at least relatively the same, certainly not as divergent or different as we see now, ranging from over a billion to about 5 billion. And what we've seen over time is growth in many of these sectors in terms of exports, where corn at one point was even still comparable to soybean exports as late as around 2007. Now, a lot of what drove the growth in soybean exports was increasing demand in China, and that was partly a function of China joining the WTO, or World Trade Organization, liberalizing some aspects of its agricultural sector, leading to this increase in demand for foreign agricultural production. So the US benefited from this quite a bit, particularly US soybeans. And so now you can see sort of where we are, right? 26 billion in soybeans, 9 billion in corn, and about 6 billion in cotton, as well as 6 billion in wheat. Now, then it raises a very important question: how important are exports to overall production? Right? And the answer is it depends on the sector. So, one of the things you could see from this graph is how important the export market is for US cotton production. This is nearly 80%, which means we pretty much are producing cotton for global textile production, primarily in Asian markets and Southeast Asian markets, but only 20%, or to be exact, 22% of domestically produced cotton is used here domestically within the United States, right? So about half of the wheat and about half of the soybeans we produce is for global markets, and then around 20% of corn. But as you could see from the previous slide, that corn ranked second in terms of overall exports. So even this 20% results in a large amount and an important amount of agricultural exports for the United States. All right, so next let's look at a breakdown of sort of export volume. So here we're not sort of thinking about value, the actual quantity being exported in 2020 and the importance of particular destination markets for export disappearance. So as mentioned in the previous slide, about half of the soybeans we produce are sold to foreign countries, right? But now half or more than half of that total sold to foreign countries are sold to China. So China accounts for over half of our soybean exports, right? The next largest destination market, Mexico, is far smaller by comparison. And here you see 5 million metric tons. Right? So China is clearly the story behind US soybean growth over time in terms of exports, as well as the impacts of the trade war on the overall sector in the United States. So you could clearly see why Chinese retaliatory tariffs, for example, on US soybeans was so impactful in terms of depressing US soybean prices as well as US soybean exports. Next, to look at corn, which is about 52 million metric tons in 2020. And you could see China is relatively less important, but still important nonetheless, ranked third in 2020 at about 6.9 million metric tons. And obviously not smaller, but not significantly smaller than say what we ship to Mexico, our leading destination, of about 15 million metric tons, as well as what we ship to Japan, which is about 10 million metric tons. Wheat, a much more diversified market, and we do a lot of wheat to a lot of countries. So therefore, this is one of the few instances where my aggregation, which is sort of all countries other than say the top 15 or top 20 destinations aggregated into a single entity, where here many of those smaller countries add up to more than the leading destination. But in 2020, a big part of the wheat that we exported went to the Philippines, Mexico, Japan, and you could see here China at about 2.3 million metric tons. So China's still important, just not necessarily the leading destination. And a lot of what we ship to the world in terms of wheat exports, much more diversified in terms of destination markets. Cotton, on the other hand, comes very close to soybeans. Here I did do the conversion for you. So these are in bales. In 2020, we exported about 17.6 million bales, and in bales here are 400-pound bales. And you could clearly see China being the leading destination at about 5.4 billion. Whereas Vietnam, very close to at 3.6 billion. And this particular year is actually a function of the trade war, because there was this increasing trend of more and more cotton exports to Vietnam. And in fact, Vietnam emerged as the leading destination for US cotton. But part of that is driven by the fact that in Vietnam, cotton is sort of further processed into yarn, and then that gets re-exported to the Chinese market. And so in one instance, one could think about sort of Vietnam just sort of as a transshipment first stage processing destination for US exports. But as a result of the US-China phase one trade deal, clearly this increase in Chinese purchases of US exports has made China the leading destination for US cotton once again. Now, here's a breakdown in terms of these commodities. I also included soybean meal just as a point of reference here. For the state of Tennessee, from 2015 to 2019, what's important here is that these are what are called state exports data from the Economic Research Service, and they're not necessarily the actual amount exported from the state. But these data are good for this reason. What they represent are our cash receipt shares of total production, and then that share then is multiplied by total exports. So for example, if Tennessee is 15% of total soybean production, then the assumption by ERS is that they should at least be, or we should at least be 15% of total soybean exports. So even if we're not, that's the assumption behind these data. And so nationally, we ranked 16th in terms of soybean cash receipts, 9th for cotton, 16th for soybean meal, 17th for corn, 18th for wheat. And you could just sort of see how things have changed over time. Clearly, the decline in soybeans being a function of the trade war between the US and China, with some recovery in 2019. Now, I want to contrast these data with actual state data from the Department of Commerce. And so these data are sort of constructed by ERS, but this next slide reflects actual commerce data recorded at ports. Now, the question is, well, why do we have these two different types of data? And that's because commerce data does not account for the fact that a product may have originated in Tennessee, was trucked to, say, the port in Georgia and Savannah, or maybe even down through Mississippi or Louisiana. And oftentimes what gets produced in Tennessee can be attributed to other states, because commerce can't necessarily track the origin, but it certainly can track the point when it leaves the United States. And so the point here is, that so much cotton gets consolidated in West Tennessee, that as far as commerce is concerned, we export far more than what we're on record for producing in terms of cash receipts. And you can see here where in 2019, our cotton exports, at least the value that's attributed to the state, decreased to less than 700 million. Now it's above 700 million. Note those numbers clearly far higher than the export data as it relates to what ERS puts out, which implies basically that say cotton from Arkansas and other places are being attributed to the port. And so hence Tennessee is getting credit. The other thing I want you to see is that the other categories, even though we rank high in cash receipts, bulk commodities like wheat, corn, and soybeans produced in Tennessee and exported are often not attributed to the state of Tennessee. So none of those commodities are within our top categories according to the Department of Commerce. And so I just want you to sort of see that distinction, sort of understand that that actual trade data may not necessarily reflect what we're actually exporting. But then if you take the cash receipt approach, which is what ERS is doing, it may not necessarily be what we're exporting either. All right, so now I want to pivot to the US outlook for agricultural trade. China is so important to US exports, and with the implementation of this phase one trade agreement and the sort of the phasing down of lockdown orders as a result of COVID-19 and the reopening of international markets and the expectation that global demand will recover, the USDA is forecasting a record year for agricultural exports, $157 billion, right? And that was actually revised upward $5 billion from that same forecast in February. And so USDA is clearly sort of bullish on what they think agricultural exports are going to do moving forward. Now, what's important here is this bullish expectation is really a story about the expectations and increases in exports to China due to the phase one trade deal. And so one of the things that's expected is a record soybean exports in 2021 of about $27.4 billion, primarily driven by strong demand in China. Right. And so exports to China are expected to be a record overall. Right. So, but soybeans primarily driving that. Cotton exports are also expected to be around $6 billion. And so, based both on higher prices as well as higher volume. What's interesting about cotton is it suffered more so than other agricultural commodities as a result of the pandemic, because clearly we're talking about a commodity not used in food production, right? And so human beings must eat regardless of a pandemic, whereas clearly the pandemic significantly decreased demand for things like clothing, apparel, and other textiles. I highlight some livestock expectations here because there's clearly a feed component to this, but beef is expected to be up, pork unchanged, but pork was already relatively high. So because of African swine fever in China, and the unchanged forecast for pork is simply saying we expect it to remain high. And then also an increase or an expected increase in poultry products. But once again, the big story here in terms of what USDA is forecasting, if you read their report, it's all about expected increases in Chinese purchases, mostly due to the phase one trade agreement between the US and China. All right, and here's why I actually sort of showed you livestock, because here's a perfect example of even when we sort of think about livestock growth, why this still will translate into a greater demand for soybeans and feed grains. And here's something you see. This is just a breakdown of global soybean use, right? So, and we're talking about the full soy complex. So soy and soybean meal as well as soybean oil. And if you note, only 20%, matter of fact, less than 20% of global soybean production is for direct human use, 77% for animal feed. Right, a big part of that is chicken production, poultry production, but then another big part of that is pig production. That's also what's driving this global demand for soybeans, and particularly this increase in demand for U.S. exports, is that the Chinese are trying to rebuild their pig populations after African swine fever. So the point is, there's this huge sort of demand for soy as a result of simply trying to build up livestock production in markets around the world, and in this particular instance, China. All right. So lastly, what I'd like to do is just say a bit about the phase one trade agreement with China and its importance to U.S. agricultural exports for not just 2020, but 2021. So that agreement was signed January 2020. It addresses a lot of the tariff, not so much the new tariffs due to the trade war, but the non-tariff barriers that existed in the Chinese market that restricted US exports. It actually did not address in a direct way the tariffs or the retaliatory tariffs from the trade war. But what was important about this agreement is that the Chinese committed to what I would sort of pin as dedicated agricultural purchases, right? The Chinese agreed to commitments. And so in 2020 and in 2021, they agreed to an average of no less than $40 billion in US exports per year, right? And that could range from over 200 agricultural products. And honestly, one would say it was over ambitious because it amounted to almost a doubling of US agricultural exports to China. All right. So, how did we get here? Like, why a phase one trade agreement with China? If we just go all the way back to prior to the trade war, the tariffs that we imposed on China and the tariffs that China imposed on us, right? So we only imposed a tariff of about 3% on average on all Chinese products. Their tariff on US products on average was about 8%. And what you could see is over time, as a result of the trade war, the tariffs on US exports overall are now about 20.7%. You have to think about this as a tax on what they buy from us, as well as a tax on what we buy from them. And then if you look at the tariffs that they impose on the rest of the world, for example, which is only 6.1%, you can now see how disadvantaged we are in terms of selling agricultural products to China. And in fact, to further drive this point home, is that if we look at just sort of some of the major agricultural commodities, particularly the ones that I'm highlighting in this particular presentation, soybeans, cotton, wheat, corn, right? That all the products that sort of fall within these categories, 100%, right? That's what this 100 means, that all soybeans, regardless of that's a broad, but there's sort of these subcategories within the soybean category. All 100% was actually assessed the highest possible tariff, which was about 25%. The same for cotton, the same for wheat, and the same for corn. And so these sectors face a particularly high tariff in the Chinese market as a result of the trade war. But however, with the phase one trade agreement and China agreeing to a certain amount of agricultural purchases over the next 2 years, which should average about 40 billion per year. And mind you, they didn't have to do it all in 1 year, but the expected target for 2021, for 2020 rather, was about $33.4 billion from the perspective of US exports. China actually imported about 27.3 billion in US agriculture that year. And so what you could see is they're about 82% of that commitment. They came close. For other sectors, they did not even come this close, nowhere near this close to satisfying their committed purchases. But here in the agricultural sector, they did come particularly close. And to break this down, what you could see here is just sort of how much more, for example, they imported for, say, pork and corn. So products that sort of face some type of barrier in years past. And so therefore, the expected target was relatively low. And if you take corn, it was only expected that they would do, let's say, $200 million to satisfy the trade one agreement. But China actually imported 1.2 billion, right? Which is nearly 500% more than the commitment. Cotton was higher than expected, 1.8 billion instead of 1.6. Wheat was right on target, right? About 600 million in wheat, which was the expectation from the agreement. Where China fell short is with soybeans. It was estimated that purchases would be about 19.5 billion based on the agreement, but they actually purchased about 14.2 billion in US soybean exports. So, what are some takeaways from this presentation? All right, so number one is the global market is important, primarily row crops, right? So these major row crops are leading U.S. agricultural exports. And note that exports account for a large share of total production, ranging from 80% to cotton, half of all soybeans and wheat, and 20% for corn. Um, Tennessee's a leading state, obviously ranked high for cotton, both in terms of production as well as in terms of a point of exit for this particular region. And we're in the top half of states in overall sales for these four commodities. Uh, Now, one of the things I think we also should take away from this is the importance of China and what's driving this expected good year in 2021 is the importance of China. And so, what we have is the phase one trade agreement, the expected sales, which this year is expected to be over 40 billion, right? If the Chinese are to satisfy that agreement. Clearly, soybeans is a story because of how important soybeans are to US exports to China, but cotton as well. And corn is also expected to be higher, clearly because we did sort of face trade barriers in years past. And so, with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening. Hopefully, you got quite a bit out of this presentation and just a greater understanding of global markets. I invite you all, for those of you on Twitter, you could follow me at UT Ag Trade. That's at UT Ag Trade. And with that, I thank you all. And you can email me if you have any questions about this presentation. And obviously, we invite you to visit the link below in order for you to get credit for this video. Thank you very much.